All right, here we go. Learning a Sicha about what we're calling unity and separation. Essentially, a Sicha about Kilayim. Kilayim is the general category of things that individually are permitted, but when they become a mixture, they are forbidden. So we've seen different verses about what those forbidden things are, and essentially crossbreeding, and it comes from don't plow with an ox and a donkey together, but that extends to crossbreeding. Don't sow different species in your vineyard, which is in general, you're not supposed to mix up seeds when you're sowing your field. And then Shanis, don't wear a mixture of wool and linen together. Then right after it tells us about Shanis, it right away says, and you should be making these gedilim, these twisted threads on your garment. The commentaries come in to tell us why is one juxtaposed, why is one thing after the other, to tell us that tzitzis, there's an exception, mitzvah exception, that tzitzis are going to be Shanis. Also, we have another exception, and that's the clothing of the Kohanim, the priests, what they wore, they had a belt. From all the required garments, there was a belt, and that was made out of Shatnez also. They could wear the priestly garments, they could walk around the priestly garments within the temple service, etc., but the belt can only be worn during actual temple service. If they were not engaged in the service, dressed to be part of the service, if they were just walking around, they had to take the belt off, because it's Shatnez, and Shatnez is only allowed for the service. Eventually, we ended up expanding the category to say there's actually another kind of kalayim we don't usually see within this grouping. The other kind of kalayim is mixing meat and milk together. And that we see from a verse that tells us very explicitly you shouldn't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So we could have thought maybe there's also an exception for this when it comes to sacrifices. Maybe God allows us because he wants his meat cooked with butter or something. And then the verse very explicitly tells us no. And we saw from the Shalah, who was a Kabbalist, and the Shalah brings out the Recanati. I don't know if that's a pronounce. Recanati was an Italian Kabbalist. So really, there's also a wine called that. So really, his name would probably be something like Recanati. It's a 1600s Kabbalist who lived in Europe, quoting an Italian Kabbalist who lived a few hundred years before him to say that mixing meat and milk, it's not just about, God said this isn't permitted, this is a kosher law, but actually when we understand the origins of where they're coming from, you're talking about mixing celestial origins, which we would call part of the divine attributes. You'd be mixing meat, which is red, comes from gevura, severity, judgment, strength, etc. Milk, which is white. White is actually also the color of chesed, but here we're talking about racham and mercy. You're mixing up strength, justice, and mercy, and justice is going to temper mercy if you do that. So there's other things going on in the world besides what we can see. It's part of understanding that there's multiple dimensions of existence. Whatever we do here in this world has ripple effects beyond just us here right now. There are things that are going on in higher dimensions, which we always talk about. The fact that we're not just here, we're not just doing stuff. This is, oh, I just put a coin for tzedakah. No, it's not just that. There's massive ripple effects. Oh my goodness. I was at a bris, and there's a college student who's becoming more religious. He had wanted to daven before he came to the bris, but whatever ended up happening, he didn't, so he ended up bringing his tefillin with him to the bris. While we were waiting, etc., so he kind of went into the corner over there to daven. And then you bring tefillin and you put it in front of Chabad rabbis. You know, it's not just going to sit there. So I saw him a little bit later afterwards when he was wrapping up his tefillin. He kind of made this comment of, I think, 7 mitzvos. I guess they got 7 people, however many people they got to put on the tefillin once they had it there. And that's like something about how when you brought the tefillin, he's like, I didn't do anything. I just brought the tefillin. Well, it's the person who drops the stone that creates the ripples. And he's like, yes. And it doesn't even matter how big the stone is. Wow, that was actually very deep. He's like, was it? I didn't know if that made sense. That was very profound. It doesn't matter how big the stone that you drop. It creates a ripple effect. Sometimes it's not just about, oh, I did this title action. All I did is show up with this tefillin. Hey, can we use these? Yes. And then 7 more people got a mitzvah, put it on tefillin. That's incredible. And he wasn't necessarily the one who put it on. Somebody else was putting it on people. But still, he brought the tefillin. So it's an incredible situation to think that everything that we're doing has a ripple effect. When we're doing mitzvos, it's not just big, small, etc. Everything is not just a thing. Everything is something. There's something bigger there than just, oh, I dropped the stone in. There's always a ripple effect. Not just in the physical realms, but also in spiritual realms. As we've learned many times before. Anyways, we went through the whole thing that we saw what the Gemara has to say according to Nazir, talking about bread dipped in wine and etc. And so when it comes to meat and milk, the Torah forbids just cooking meat and milk together, but it is still forbidden even to soak it. You can't marinate meat and milk because the rabbinic prohibition comes in. That a lot of what we know from kosher, as far as the prohibitions goes, because the Torah says something specific and then the rabbis expand upon that and we have rabbinic prohibitions that come in. So it's still prohibited, it's just where's the origin of that prohibition coming in. And then we got to the idea about how you can't use something that's forbidden. Part of the idea of you can't use this crossbred animals that doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like, which means that it's imperfect. You can't have something with a blemish, can't be used as a sacrifice. Why can't I take a crossbred animal and either sacrifice it to God or bring it as a gift to God, etc.? It's because it has to be perfect. What's given to God in this regard has to be perfect. Humans, we do the best we can, but as far as what we're going to give as a gift to God, it has to be perfect, and we can't use forbidden stuff to do a mitzvah. So we saw from Tanya, eventually we kind of wrapped everything up, and then we're having our question to the Sicha, which we haven't totally answered yet, about why is there an exception / mitzvah when it comes to shatnez, kalayim, but not for the other kind of kalayim. What distinguishes it? I was telling the other class today, before we get into the text now, we're still going to see even more technical stuff when it comes to the Sicha because we're discussing halachos and things like that. Like when we saw the whole thing with Nazir about the piece of bread and the wine. And I was saying, if you think about it, if you've ever met somebody who's really into something, like a Trekkie or something, or somebody really into Harry Potter could quote all the lines to you and they could tell you the origins of even the casting, even on our own small scale to experience it or to have met someone like that, we realize the idea that when you really love something, when you're really into something, then you know everything about it. And we're going to take this all the way back. You go back to Avram. What distinguished Avraham was not that he was the first person to recognize that there's one God in the world. Noah spoke to God. Adam spoke to God. Then we have the Yeshiva, Shem, and Aver. So there was a whole line over there of people who knew that there's a God. They studied Torah, whatever it was like in those days. The difference with Avram is that Avram's love of God was so deep, so far-reaching, that he had to go tell people about it. It was something that he loved so much, he had to make sure that everybody knew about it. When you have a cure for something that you know is true, you have to tell people. You have to let people know about this. Avram could have just sit with the knowledge of God and was going to sit in his tent and nothing happened. He had to go tell everybody about it. That's what distinguishes Avraham. Also, we're talking about kind of in broad terms, that his love drove him that I must tell other people that there's a God. I can't let other people not know that there's only one God in the world. And then if you continue all throughout the history, you go through our patriarchs, you go through everybody, one part, one dimension of what distinguishes them, what they're all about. It's not just the Masorah that we know eventually once we get the Torah in Har Sinai, there's a chain of passing it down through the generations. Moses gave it to Joshua gave it to the elders and the prophets, etc., men of the Great Assembly. Then you have the mission of Gemara, you have all the commentaries that come afterwards. There's a rabbinic chain, what we call Masorah, that passed down throughout the generations. But it's not just that. If you could imagine the men of the Talmud, the men of the Gemara, or any of the commentators, these are people who loved God so much. Their awe and fear of God was so deep, to such an extreme level, if you can even understand that when they're going to study Torah and they're going to see a word that God says, they can't sleep until they figure out what God's talking about. And not in some generalized term. God says to make these strings. What does he mean by that? They eat as little as is necessary for them to be alive. They sleep only as necessary. They work, because you got to work, only as necessary so that they spend the rest of their time discussing God, because they can't live otherwise. It's something that they're so into because they love it so much. We have to know what God means. When he says this, what does he mean? So you end up with the most intricate, nitpicky sometimes discussions. It's not fathomable for God to have said something that they don't break down to its minutest detail to understand wholly, and that's driven by love and fear of God. The last member that we learned about Lo Sima Shekeh, they're talking about, you should have love and fear of God and divine service. If you could understand, this is how far-reaching it can be. It's not just a matter of when I do a mitzvah, I understand everything that's going on. Is that if God's going to say something to me, I have to understand the most intricate detail. What is he talking about? Because I want to make sure that for him, I'm going to be as perfect in what I'm giving to him as possible. And then there's all the argument that goes back and forth, but he said it like this and not like this. Also, by the way, because if he didn't mention this, does that create a pathway? That's what we'd call a loophole, maybe. So you think the rabbis, they sit and they're talking all day long. They're not just academics who are pontificating. It's love and fear that's driving them. That they have to be talking about God all day long. To understand him, to serve him, and all that sort of stuff. So when we're going to see a lot of the technical things that we're looking at, it's not just a bunch of academics. These are people who are so driven. Their existence is love and fear of God that, of course, we have to break down everything that God says. Because by love and fear will not allow it to be otherwise. That's just one thing to think about. It's a dimension in all of this. Okay, there's a book I'm working through now. I'm only doing a page or two at a time because just a bunch of small thoughts and teachings. So if you start doing too many, none of it's going to sink in. There's a section on humility. So this is Chassidic. Well, Chassidus/Chabad Chassidus talking about humility. This is what it's saying. Humility is not thinking that you're less. It's not thinking that you're smaller than what you are. Humility is actually recognizing, and this is in italics, that you are absolutely nothing before God. Now, that's a full sentence, but it's not the full sentence. Because first you have to know how you're absolutely nothing before God. And now that you recognize that, now that you know that you're nothing, now you could actually start to serve God. Once you recognize how much of a nothing you are, now you could actually embark on your service of God. It's knowing that because I'm nothing, so remember what we said, all your wants, desires, etc. get put to the side, because what God's going to ask us of me, and I'm going to start pontificating about what I want. Well, actually, I don't really agree with this. No. And then the other thing to realize that if I'm absolutely nothing before God, anything I get from him, I should be overwhelmed with gratitude. Because who am I to have received anything? I'm such a nothing. So the fact that God has given me this, everything is the most consequential thing that it could ever be. So you can see how it's breaking someone's ego all the way till you understand that you're nothing. Obviously, it's also talking about the greatness of God, that who's man to stand before him. You also have that. There's so many factors, different levels of the same subject. First, you have to understand how great God is, how much of an everything God is, how you are just nothing. Once you're there, now you could actually really serve God. Now you could do a mitzvah. It has nothing to do with you. It's only because of God that you're doing it. And you do it with joy, with gratitude, because God, who is in everything and I am in nothing, he has allowed me to do this for him. It's mind-boggling. It's a shift. It's an entire reframing. You could approach life like that. Everything's different. Good talk. Okay, we had a short recap recap, but we had a lot of sidebars. But either way, we have finally come to the point where we could say, let's read the text for section 3. This, you see, it starts with Gimel. We're going to read the text of section 3. Then after this, we're going to be able to start going through the texts that comprise the text of the section. Very good. Text for section 3. To understand this according to the words of the Ramban, which we'll see the commentary of it, that specifically when it comes to the wearing of shatnez, this is what Chazal said on this, or sages have said about this, that this is one of the things that the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world, basically, they mock us for. They don't say the same necessarily for crossbreeding animals. To say from all the different kinds of kalayim, makes sense, doesn't make sense, etc., the one that gets the most derision of, really, you do this, who cares about this, that you're following, is shatnez over the other kinds of mixtures. We're going to explain some of that. As we've been seeing, there's something different about shatnez. To clarify the reason for this, clarifying this, when it comes to the mixtures of clothing, that we call shatnez, rolling it together, the reason for why this is forbidden is hidden. We really don't know. This is not the case, this is not so. For when it comes to mixtures of animals, in the same kind of vein, mixtures of seeds, when it comes to the ground, we can understand the reason for this prohibition. Even though it's a chok that we don't fully understand, but we can have more understanding to an extent when it comes to the other kinds of mixtures and when it comes to shatnez. At the time when Hashem created all the creations according to their categories, when God unfurled the catalog of all creation, when it came to plants and when it came to Baalei Nefesh, owners of soul, so basically all the other things that are alive, think of animals, etc., he gave them the power of procreation, the power to give birth to offspring, so that they could establish the species, as in they could perpetuate the species. God commanded, when he says you're going to be fruitful and multiply, etc., that they will bring forth according to their kind. This is very, very important. This is the note that Hashem said, according to your kind. That's why even though you see all the plants growing wild out in the wild, they don't graft themselves. They haven't created something new, because each creates according to its kind. If Hashem said to the plants directly, or if the plants heard from the animals, etc., but either way, crossbreeding doesn't naturally happen. The animals out of the wild, they all go according to their kinds. Therefore, that when a person comes and he starts mixing up these mixtures, he's making a mess out of stuff. He crossbreeds two animals, or two kinds of seeds together. That through this, he's changing their nature, also their form, when they're going to be deriving nutrition from each other. And it's going to be like every seed is going to be as if it came from two kinds. Oh, so here it's not just about crossbreeding and grafting. It's saying that even if you're just plowing with two kinds of animals, let's say, or for example, even if you're just sowing the seeds, you're kind of mixing it all together. But if they're all going to be mixed up together, you're not planting each according to its kind, then they're feeding off of each other. The seeds are feeding off of each other, and it's going to be as if you've created something new. So that's why when things have to be planted, each according to its kind. Nice, clear sections of what everything is. So when a person comes and he starts mixing things up, he's changing. There's a fundamental change that's going on here right now, and he's mixing up the works of creation. God created everything very specifically, and God created each thing according to its kind, and he told each thing you will reproduce according to your kind. Each species to produce of its own species. Now a person comes in and he starts, we'll plow with this together, we'll sow at random in the fields. You're creating new kinds, and that's not how God wanted it to be. By the way, this is distinct from, for example, when we are per se finishing the works of creation. That would be wheat grinded to flour and we turn that into bread. That's just finishing the process. That's a through line. That's a direct path of what it is. That's not creating something new. That is just taking what we have and going through with it, taking it to its end, basically. Not the same thing as creating a new species. We don't just get to do science experiments on God's species. The command when it comes to animals isn't just not to crossbreed them, but it's also don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. Don't plow with two different species together. Why? Because it's the way of things, it's the way of those who work the ground, the tillers of the soil, farmers, that if you're going to plow them together, you're going to bring them together into the same barn, into the same structure, and that could come to crossbreeding. So that's why God doesn't just say don't deliberately crossbreed, it's also don't do things that can inadvertently lead to crossbreeding. It goes back also to the idea of the seeds. So I didn't graft something new, but the fact that I'm throwing out all the seeds together could lead to this new thing being produced because now they're all feeding into each other, and it's going to be as if it came from two different things. And that's a fundamental change to the species of what's being sown. We find that there is a difference, a very fundamental difference, between the mixtures of animals, the mixtures of ground, of the seeds, and the mixtures of clothing. Why? There's something different about shatnez, something different about why it gets singled out for mockery, etc. When it comes to mixing up animals, so the mixtures of animals, the crossbreeding of animals and the mixture of seeds, when you're mixing up species in the ground, when you're sowing, the mixture that happens also affects the power of reproduction of two kinds. Two seeds are feeding off each other, something new is going to come out of it. Something fundamental has been changed, and that has to do with its power of reproduction, has been changed on a fundamental level. This mixture affects them in a very fundamental core way. That's a mitzvah in the essence of their existence, of what they are. What we're finding from this, what comes out of this, doing this acts against the order of the works of creation. They specifically need to be liminehu, after their kind. So it's not just, hey, look what I made out of this. No. This creation of something new goes against the fundamental structure of creation that everything must be according to its kind. You've changed something on a fundamental level. You can't reproduce. God's trying to tell you something with that. Part of the idea, if you could mate a mule, it's not like you might get a horse or a donkey. No, you create something totally different when you have the horse and the donkey together. Which is not the case when it comes to mixtures of clothing. And the mixture does not affect, it's not at the essence of the existence of wool and linen. It's only an external mixture. It's just that you've combined them both into the same kind of clothing, the same place, and the same kind of garment. But even after you've mixed them together into the same garment, there's still wool and linen, as they were before. You could even sense it. You could say there's wool, there's linen. Even if you have a wool suit that has linen lapels or something, you could extract the linen because they're not actually mixed, not at a fundamental level. Versus an animal, if you have a mule, you can't just be like, oh, I'll extract the horse from it. I'll take the donkey out of it. You can't do that because you've created something totally different. Fundamentally, it's different. To the extent that you can separate them, one from the other. Again, in summation, what have we seen? There's something different about the mixture of wool and linen. Because unlike when it comes to animals or seeds or things like that, when there is a mixture, as in kalayim, that we have taken two permitted things and made something new out of it, we've actually changed something on a fundamental level. And here specifically, we're bringing the power of reproduction is changing. It's not the same thing. It's not according to its kind. It's not according to its species. Wool and linen are different because even after you mix them, you could still tell this is wool, this is linen. We have not created something new. We don't have a term of wool and linen together. It's just wool and linen mixed together. They are still separate to the extent that you could actually separate them afterwards. So that's what we're learning in this section here. Now that we have asked the question, we expanded the question. We saw in our question there's something different about Shabbos, and now we're starting to understand and answer what is different about Shabbos.